Thank you very much, Jacques. I've been given the delightful job of giving you some insights into ethical foundations of environmental radiological protection. We'll start with an example question to get you thinking. This question was on the agenda of a workshop in Tokyo, not long after the Fukushima accident. And it was the title of a presentation entitled, "What is the Economic Cost of Marine Contamination After Fukushima?" And it was given by a wonderful ecological economist called Shunsuke Manako from Tokuhu University. And you can find the presentation and also a discussion of this presentation widely on the net. And he approached this from an ecological economic point of view. He said, well, yes, there's the direct cost from loss of sales. There's also a whole series of ecological impacts of actually bans in fishing in the area. There are, possibly more controversially, a lot of savings from government fishing subsidies because the fishing industry in Japan was subsidized by the government. But at the same time, there are more complex social and economic problems here. There's a decrease in market value of marine products, even those that are non-contaminated, the loss of market value there. There are obviously consequences of potential radiation effects in those organisms, and also societal demographic consequences from loss of livelihoods of fishermen and loss of access to sites of cultural or community heritage. So to start an ethics talk with an economic question might sound a bit strange, but in this way of looking at the potential consequences of environmental contamination for society and the environment, I thought it was an excellent presentation that really underlined the challenges we're facing here. So, another way of valuing the environment. How do we value the environment ethically and in the context of environmental radiation protection? Actually, for a development in radiological protection in general, this is an area where there has actually been quite a lot of philosophical and ethical aspects addressed during the development. It might reflect the fact that it was starting to get very fashionable to think about philosophy and ethics at the time this system was developing. But not only the ICRP, but also IEA, IUR, and also NEA, and a wonderful series of conferences that Ted Lasso had introduced in the Science and Values, they all addressed philosophical, ethical aspects of environmental protection. Stakeholder engagement was also popular at the time, so this was a rather pompous title for a consensus conference held in 2001 on looking at ethical, philosophical and environmental issues in radiological protection. Also with the participation of the then Scientific Secretary of ICRP, Jacques Valentine, who was on the organising committee here. And we tried to come to a consensus on policy development and environmental protection. And I won't read that first part of the statement, the guiding principles, but I think it's interesting to notice that you will find human dignity, you'll find fair distribution of harms and benefits, you'll find development of policy in open, transparent and participatory ways. And again, if you want more information on that small contribution to stakeholder engagement and protection of environment, this has been published and you can find the background. So, other things that were going on, European Union projects at that time also had a lot of stakeholder engagement, the ERICA EU project led by Carl Magnus Larsen. We had, I think, 8 different stakeholder consultations with a very wide variety of people, including environmental toxicologists, ecotoxicologist industry, a whole wide range of participation there. And this is 10 years back, and if you look closely at this slide later, you'll find a number of members who are actually sitting in the room here who were participating in these debates. It was mostly professional discussion, so not with lay people, but there was actually also layperson consultation on issues of environmental protection carried on there. So it was a system that was developed in a sort of tendency to take stakeholder engagement and philosophical, ethical issues seriously. Of course, yeah, that's also been reported if you're interested in more on that. So, but back to ICRP Publication 91. Now, many of you will have heard Jan Pentreath possibly give presentations on this at the time of the publication. Jan Pentreath was one of the people who was involved in many of those discussions in the IEA task group in IUR, and also, obviously, a main person in ICRP. So you might have heard some of this by Jan Pentreath already. But I think it's worth actually looking at that, because that is a rather special publication. It addresses things that are not normally addressed in ICRP publications in terms of ethics and background. So what kind of things does it do? It was based also, very strongly based on other publications in the area, the IAEA ethical assessment, for example. But it asked this main question that are asked by environmental philosophers: what has moral standing in the world and why? And it recognises that there are lots of different factors that influence the way people perceive the environment, including, of course, science, but also culture, religion, art. And these are conceptualised. This is the environmental philosophical point of view. These are conceptualised in different philosophical views on what has moral standing in the environment. And these are all described in publication 91. It describes the anthropocentric view, the standing that only human beings are the entities and the only entities that have moral standing. So, yes, consequences to the environment count, but they only have value, they only have impacts in the sense that they impact on human interests. So it's a widely recognised philosophical point of view, it's a widely debated philosophical point of view as to the value judgments behind that, and meta-ethical questions on, where our values come from, and interesting discussions on do animals have any kind of moral sense. But putting all that aside, it's not without problems. Even if you subscribe to a purely anthropocentric view, you still have problems like we saw in the economic valuation of the environment, how you actually go about valuing the environment from a human point of view. There can be very many different interests and very many different ways of looking at an environmental system and deciding that that has value for humans. So there's just one example here where we may have conflicts in how to value, what to do in terms of, for example, is it correct to build a large tourism park on the site of a national park, things like that. So, not without its own problems. A different approach is a biocentric approach. This contends that moral standing can be extended to individual members of other species. Obligations pertaining to such individuals arise as a consequence of that. Now, everybody with a biocentric view agrees that it's more than humans that can have moral standing. They have very different views on actually which of those living entities could have moral standing, depending on the criteria that they use for deciding what has moral standing. Is it some kind of rationality or awareness of the environment? Is it sentience, the ability to feel pain? Or some kind of very general instrumental or inherent worth? So there's still disagreement within this group of worldviews on actually what has moral standing, but they all agree it's something to do with the individual characteristics of those organisms. For an example, the environmental philosopher, or the philosopher Peter Singer, would say you'd probably draw the line at around a shrimp. Below that, you probably, because his is based on sentience and the ability to feel pain. So around the shrimp, organisms below that, we can probably say they don't count, but above that, yes, they would have some counting because of their ability to feel pain. This also derives from, if you're interested in more general philosophical views, you can have utilitarian views of biocentrism that are focused on the feeling of pain, but also deontological views that are more to do with these rights-based. So, but they all agree that it's individual animals that count here. Finally, the ecocentric view this is simply moral standing can be extended to virtually everything in the environment, including landscapes, rivers, mountains. But the focus here is not just a simple extension from an animal, a biotic, to an abiotic. It's a different view totally of what counts in moral standing. It's the entirety and the diversity of the ecosystem, rather than, sorry, I lost the end of that, the individual sum of the components. And one of the most famous quotes here, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, wrong when it tends otherwise. Again, not without its own problems. How do we actually decide whether something is preserving integrity, stability, and beauty? But it's a holistic view of environmental protection. So still, there are a variety of views here and a variety of opinions on the solutions. They all ascribe moral standing to an ecosystem level rather than the individuals. And different points of view, some more extreme than others. Arne Næss, a Norwegian philosopher, that simply humans have no right to interfere with richness and diversity of the ecosystem except to satisfy vital needs. But it is a view that looks at ecosystems, ecosystem functioning as the main source of value. So, again, if you want to read more about that, they are described in ICRP Publication. With that background, the conclusion is that actually all these three theories can support the need to protect the environment. We don't need to actually choose one to say why we should protect the environment. They can all support it. Antropocentrism can give very powerful grounds for assessing environmental impacts, but it also recognises that there are a number of worldviews out there who have different views on why things matter. So they're reflected in many religions and cultures, and it needs to be a system that can address and discuss all those philosophical worldviews. It's not necessary to actually choose one. So the other thing in ICRP 91 is to look down for other areas of agreement. So we don't need to find agreement on the philosophical worldviews, similar to what we're doing in Task Group 94, a lower level, agreement on other types of principles. And the ones discussed are conservation, biodiversity, preservation, environmental justice, sustainable development, and human dignity. It also talks about some second-level principles, precautionary principle, and also informed consent. So this document also touches on the importance of stakeholder involvement here. And the rationale behind this is that all other things being equal, ionising radiation should not be treated different to other stressors. So it's an attempt to make sure that any system of environmental protection for ionising radiation matches that from other environmental stressors. That doesn't mean that there aren't challenges for implementation and application, but that's the level at which the agreement on principles might lie. I'm not going to read these principles. If you're interested in more, you can look at what's stated in ICRP 91. But principle, just point out a few important things here. So sustainable development, also underlining the importance of present and future generations, environmental justice, not dissimilar to the justice that was presented by Kunru, but also taking account of distribution of benefits and harms in environment. And again, also human dignity, which might sound strange to have in an environmental document and indicative of a very anthropocentric point of view. But it points out that if you're respecting human dignity, you also respect the views that many humans may have on non-anthropogenic views of environmental protection. So, conservation again, conservation, preservation, this is one that wasn't in the IEA document, and maintenance of diverse biodiversity. If you want, there may be examples of different ways in which we might address the well-being or environmental health, or they might be examples being inspired by Gaston's presentation of ethics of care in the environment, however one you look at it. But they are areas where we can be informed on environmental protection. Okay, so final points, some final little discussion points here. As I said, it's actually possibly the implementation application that throwing up some challenges here. So some quick points. What is harm? Impacts of remediation. This was addressed by David briefly yesterday as well. And ecological complexity. Now I'll try and give a little bit of comparison with some other environmental stresses or environmental issues to show that these aren't discussion points or problems that only apply to ionizing radiation. So, what is harm? When does change become damage? And a lot of the debates on environmental consequences of ionizing radiation purport a whole range of different changes. Changes in genetic diversity, changes in populations, changes even at ecosystem levels. There's a lot of scientific and very public debate on whether those changes exist and whether those changes can be attributed to exposure to ionizing radiation. But the way you view that damage depends on your view on whether those changes matter, and it might depend on their views on impacts on biodiversity, conservation, preservation. And again, this isn't an area that is specific for ionizing radiation. I put this up because it's also an excuse to show on research ethics teaching. In Norway, teaching of research ethics is actually obligatory for every single PhD student. And this is an example of a case we use to illuminate problems of when is change harmful and not, and all the factors that influence on that. So it's a glowfish, a genetically modified fish that glow under ultraviolet light, developed for toxicological testing. They're now possible to buy in certain countries. And the students are asked to discuss this. So it's the discussion of what we actually mean by change and harm. Are we harming the organisms? Anyway, that's a little bit of a side. I'll get back to more routine cases now. Impacts of remediation. These are clearly usually carried out for anthropocentric grounds, so remediation because of reducing doses to humans. And in fact, the environmental consequences are often more concerned with is the environmental consequences of the remediation process itself. What does it mean to scrape off topsoil or remove trees? It's hard actually to find examples of pure biocentric or ecocentric driven remediation. They usually are, even if you're doing it because you're wanting to protect the environment, it is for humans that are making the decisions and humans are driving the remediation. So that's going to be very case and context specific differences. As a parallel, there's also, I was trying to think of one that really could be, a remediation that was clearly for the benefit of environment rather than man. Maybe oil spill cleanups. But even those are not without their debates. There's debates on the chemicals used to clean up oil spills. Are they actually more damaging to the environment than the oil itself? So it's an area where there will always be complexity and debates and a need to actually look on a case-specific, on each case specifically to see exactly what the issues are. Finally, embracing ecological complexity. And this is the recognition that, as for other environmental stresses, ionizing radiation can cause indirect effects in populations. It's not just direct effects. Those populations are interacting with each other, boxes are being eaten by other boxes, there's competition between species. So you can have impacts that are not necessarily due to pure direct effects of ionizing radiation. This raises a whole lot of questions on which endpoints we actually monitor to maybe control those ecosystem changes, diversity, functionality. But once again, it's not something that's specific to ionizing radiation. This is debates that are going on in all contexts of environmental stresses, right back to Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring, which was debating impacts of the chemical industry and was DDT causing damage purely because of direct impacts on birds, or whether complex ecological consequences of, for example, loss of food caused by the pesticides. So it's an area that is of great interest to all environmental chemistry and ecotoxicologists. This brings me back to the first presentation, this first idea of the interaction between society, economy, and environment. And environmental issues are always going to reflect that complex interaction. It's described in the sustainability pillars of economic, societal, and environmental interactions. So the ecosystem approach both looks at the scientific challenges in dealing with that complexity, but also the societal challenges in recognizing that all these issues are interrelated. So it's, I think we can find some deal of agreement on principles of environmental protection. We can find them embedded in a lot of international conventions, for example. But actually implementation in environmental legislation, legal requirements, those are particularly challenges at the moment. There are, if you look, differences between nations on how they address environmental radiation protection. Some do it explicitly, others don't. There are ongoing debates on standards, benchmarks, guidance. Questions on how this might be applied in planning and exist situations, and also the degree to which environmental protection and human protection can and should be integrated. So, its conclusions. So I would contend that actually the ethical foundation of environmental radiation protection has been addressed in a number of ICRP and other publications. You may not agree with what's said there, you may not agree with the way it's been addressed, but it has been addressed. There have been attempts to look at what the ethical aspects are of environmental protection. I would also say that if we really want a holistic evaluation of environmental impacts of ionizing radiation, that's also not considering just direct impacts of health on humans and non-humans, but also to be aware of the complex social, ecological, ethical and economic consequences of environmental exposures. I think we might say that if we can promote environmental radiation protection, that might also help to improve interaction between chemical and radiological disciplines, also including an improved comparison of what the potential consequences of radiation is or are compared to other environmental hazards, to be able to put those in context with the impacts of environment of other hazards. Well, as I think further explorations on implementation and applications would be useful. So, thank you for your attention.